So I am going to close the complete version of the project. I have two instances of Unity running here. I'm going to close the complete version. And ta-da, behind it, I have the incomplete version. Now I'm going to start by expanding the particle splatter folder, which is where the content that we're going to be working with is. And then in the scenes folder, we have a scene called main. Let's double click that to open it. And what you'll see in here is we have the splatter particles are already pre-made, and they have the splat on collision script, which we will basically just use as is, since it's almost identical to the other techniques that we're going to be looking at. We have the FPS controller, but the FPS controller does not yet have the particle launcher attached, and we haven't yet made the decal particle systems. So we're going to write those scripts and make those systems over the course of this training. So the first thing that we want to do is to create our launcher particle system. And we're going to do that as a child of our shooter FPS weapon game object. So with that object selected, I'm just going to push F to frame selected on the scene view, and then just kind of position it like this. I'm turning my view by holding down the Alt key, and I'm going to right click on shooter FPS weapon and choose particle system to create a new particle system as a child. Now we can see it begins spawning these kind of fuzzy white particles in a sort of a cone shape. And so the first thing that we want to do is we want to change the shape of this. We want them to emit from a point, not from a shape. So in the particle system component, we are going to go down to the shape module. If we click on it, it's going to display the gizmo for the shape that's currently being used. What we're going to do is we're just going to completely disable that module just by clicking the checkbox next to it. And so now we can see that we have just a stream of particles coming out of our gun. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a material to this. And this is a material that's provided in the project. We're going to expand the materials folder, and we're going to grab this gun spray particle material and drag it down to the bottom of the inspector to add it. It's actually quite similar, right? It's just a slightly harder soft circle. And then we are going to set the start size in the main module of the particle system to 0.5. And temporarily, I am going to apply a little bit of a tint color in the material down here at the bottom, just so that we can see it while we're working on it. We're going to reset this later on. I'm just going to make them kind of dark blue so that we can see them on the white background. Okay. So now, the next thing that we want to do is we are going to disable the speed module and enable velocity over lifetime, because we're going to be doing some kind of physics style effects with this. We're going to use velocity instead of speed. And now what we can do, if we test quickly, we can see that we're sort of almost getting there, but our particles are not really behaving like projectiles. They're kind of staying in a line following the position of the weapon. So what we want to do is we want to switch the simulation space for the particle system from local to world. And now, if we move our gun around, we can see that the particles are moving forward along the z-axis. They start out moving forward along the z-axis from the position of the gun, but then when the gun moves, they continue moving in world space along the z away from where they started. So that's kind of giving us our projectile style behavior that we want. The other thing that we're going to enable is inherit velocity. Now, this is a little bit of a detail. We don't necessarily need it, but if we were, and we're going to set the multiplier to 0.5. So what inherit velocity does is it causes the particles to inherit the velocity of the parent object. So if we have an object that's moving, then we don't want our particles to kind of fall behind it or not inherit its velocity when they're emitted. So I'm just going to read a piece from the documentation. Inherent velocity is very useful for emitting particles from a moving object, such as dust clouds from a car, smoke from a rocket, steam from a steam train's chimney, or any situation where the particles should initially be moving at a percentage of the speed of the object they appear to come from. This module only has an effect on the particles when simulation space is set to world in the main module, right? Because otherwise they would just be following the emitter, almost like being a child game object of the emitter, even though these are not game objects, they're particles. Okay, so now we have our kind of very basic particle parameters set up. Let me just take a look at the chat, and then we are going to move on to setting up collision for these particles. FFYHL Kane asks, can you give us a short summary why to use particles performance-wise? Yes. Well, I guess the very short version is particles, for one, are all rendered in a single draw call. So if we had however many 40 different objects on screen here, those would all take their own draw call or set pass call, which would be more expensive in terms of performance. That's one reason. There's multiple reasons, but basically, if you can achieve your behavior with particles instead of with game objects, it should be a bit more performance. But obviously, you're going to want to profile on device and test, to make sure. C. Strachan asks, so they move with the person's speed if running fast velocity at running speed first. Basically, let's say your player is driving in a car, right? And they're shooting out of the car, and you do not want the particles to spawn at zero velocity initially. They need to spawn at the velocity of the player and then move as they would in a physics environment, right? Since particles are not inherently physics objects, we need to make sure that we kind of manually manage their physics. Somebody's asking, how is it possible to follow a moving object with particles? You're going to have to wait till the end of the session. I'm going to provide kind of half of the answer to that question, and then you would need to write the following script, but I'm going to show you guys how to manually control the position of all the particles in your system when we write the decal script.